Alright, so you need a board for your Ryzen 5000 setup. Now this is a sharp looking board with a menacing fire-breathing dragon on it, but will it deliver for your next Ryzen CPU? Let's find out. Welcome to Machines and More. Recently I compared the Gigabyte B550 and the Asus B550 ITX boards, and there were good and bad things about each board. And today let's check out one more B550 ITX board. This one here is the MSI Gaming Edge Wi-Fi B550 ITX, and this one was requested by some of our viewers, so thanks again for suggesting this one for review. For the Gigabyte Aorus board, the pros were the build quality, the power delivery, passive board cooling, and the cons were the odd board layout, the lack of a USB-C front header. The Asus Strix kind of picks up where the Gigabyte left off with an excellent board layout, a USB-C front header, a low CPU socket position for better compatibility, but so-so power stages here, complemented by an active cooling fan. Now, just to be fair, any of these boards will run even the 3950X or 5950X at stock without issue, but if you're looking for a decent compromise, on specs alone, you might be drawn to the MSI board here. And this one has an 8+2 VRM setup with 60 amp stages. So the VRM setup is quite a bit better than the Asus. It has that USB-C front panel header that the Gigabyte lacks. But then again, this layout is a bit convoluted, and it does have a concerning design flaw, and I'll talk a little bit more about that after we take a quick look at CPU performance. Now, interestingly, even though this 5800X ran just fine with a -15 setting for curve optimizer, the MSI board was very unstable, and even a more conservative -10 on all cores was borderline, despite using the same CPU here, and the same Noctua U12A locked at identical fan speeds. The thermals for PbO2 aren't apples to apples, but it was the best that this board could run the chip at, and there is a fairly apparent thermal difference. The actual voltage difference between these two was about 25 millivolts, and the MSI pushed to about 1.34 volts, while the Asus board maintained 1.315 or so, and the clock speeds from the MSI board are also a bit lower for a multi-threaded workload such as in Blender. The thermals for a nominal fixed voltage of 1.25 volts at 4600 megahertz were also a little bit toastier. The Asus board tends to run lower actual voltages, and the MSI runs a little bit higher. VRM most temps aren't significantly different. The peak temp the board hit under PBO was 48 degrees, so really nothing to be concerned about, and I would have absolutely no concern driving a 5900X or 5950X with this board. Now, if all clock boosts matter to you, then I think this one is a touch more temperamental, although for real world performance, it really will be hard to distinguish. As for board features, it's fairly competitive with the rest of the B550 ITX boards, with a front and back M.2 slot, 5 USB 8 ports, with 2 of these USB 2, 2 USB 3.2 Gen 1, and 1 Gen 2 supporting up to 10 gigabits per second, and there is also a Gen 2 USB-C port at the back. Wi-Fi 6, 2.5G Ethernet, and audio I/O is great, with the optical out and the support for surround sound. So the I/O is quite good, but seriously, a COM port on a modern gaming MOBO, this is kind of funny. The layout of the connectors on the board are also a bit convoluted. I'm not a big fan of the layout of this particular ITX board. The fan headers are kind of spread out. There's 2 over here. The CPU and pump headers are just next to the 24-pin connector, and the case fan header is down here, next to the bottom of the RAM slots. And there is a 3-pin RGB header in a difficult to access location right underneath the RAM slots, and the front panel connector is in a super odd location adjacent to the PCIe slot. And that means it will be quite a long cable run, and at least in the NR200 that I tested in, the cable was stretched out pretty far, and also the position means that the convenient NR200 connector organizer does not fit. Now, even with a sandwich style case, this is still going to be a long way as well, so it is kind of an odd choice here by MSI. The board does not support 4-pin RGB, so if you have a 12-volt RGB component, you're going to have to use a separate controller, and there's no built-in lighting on the board anywhere itself. The Asus here just has everything laid out in a clean line up top, very simple, and I like that. This front M.2 and the chipset have this small fan here, and this actually is pretty quiet, so it's not a big concern here, unlike with some chipset fans that can be a little buzzy. You can still unplug this really easily if you don't care for it and just use this as a heatsink for your M.2. But here's the biggest gripe with this board, and this one is really a head scratcher. And this board does not have your typical back plate. You'll see 3 cutouts on the MSI one, and the keep out zone is not your typical AM4 type, like with this, right? If you're absolutely certain you will only use coolers that use the included back plate, that's fine, but many coolers don't. Like this Cooler Master back plate here, right? This would absolutely not work with this because it's going to go over those components. And lots of custom liquid cooling and AIO solutions use proprietary back plates as well, which are not going to work with this board. So this is quite limiting for upgrading and trying new things out. This socket does sit pretty high up. It's identical to the Gigabyte's position, and that meant the U12A was touching the fan grill with the NR200 test setup here. One final quirk is the location of the clear CMOS jumper. If you think you will need it, such as if you're doing a memory OC, I'd punch out the IO shield prior to mounting it on the board. It's perforated, but it would be otherwise very difficult to pull the tab out once the board is mounted up in the case, because you can only go inside out for the most part. If you do go that route, you will have a hole in your IO shield, and this really could have been streamlined with just a clear CMOS button. But yeah, if you don't pre-punch this one out, you're going to be cursing, and you're going to have to remove the whole board to access it. The board out of the box worked just fine with the 5800X, but I did update it so that I could test Curve Optimizer and also the BIOS flash function, which worked just fine with an FAT32 formatted thumb drive. Now, in terms of the BIOS, MSI's is okay. Asus and Gigabyte tend to have the more navigable layouts, but that's just a personal preference. I do like MSI's approach to memory overclocking, and the memory try-it presets are convenient, so that is a plus. But I'll sum up this board with good, bad, and ugly. So good, sharp-looking, well-built board, integrated IO shield, really lots of metal over the VRMs, decent performance, and power delivery setup. Bad, there's some strange design choices such as the lack of a 4-pin RGB header, the fan header placement's a little odd, the clear CMOS jumper, and the position of that front panel connector. And, well, okay, ugly. The back plate is potentially a deal breaker for what is an otherwise good board. It does straddle a middle ground between the Aorus and the Strix boards. The pricing is pretty comparable between these, but I'd still recommend going with either one of those 2 boards and just skip this one because there are a few too many compromises for my liking. There is one more board I hope to check out in the ASRock Phantom Gaming, and I hope you found this helpful. Thumbs up and subscribe if you did. And thanks a lot if you did already. And also thanks a lot for checking out this review today. See you again soon.